and welcome to this session on the artistic factual strand entitled Pop Art, All-Mouth, No Trousers. First of all, let me thank Kevin Madden and the Arts Desk for acting with us as media partners in the strand. It's a website I'm a great fan of personally, and I highly recommend that you will read and support if you think that serious art criticism is important and worth preserving, and it can often get edged out of mainstream media various crises that institutions are going through. And also, obviously, thanks to the Balkan Art Gallery for acting with us as partners for this session. My name is David Bowden, and I'm one of the organisers of the festival, a press officer for the Institute of Ideas, as well as being a columnist for Spike Online. Now, I'm not going to spend too long on my introduction, partly because we have a fantastic panel of speakers, and it's a great subject of debate, which I don't think requires too much introduction. I'm sure you all know why you're here. But the particular context for this debate is that we're organising this session in partnership with Barbican's brand new exhibition, Pop Art Design, which starts on Tuesday, just in the art gallery just over there, and runs until February next year. We have the curator on the panel, so I will leave her to explain the actual details of the exhibition. But it bills itself as the first comprehensive exhibition to explore the exciting exchange of ideas between artists and designers in the pop age, featuring more than 200 works by 70 designers. Battle attendees are entitled to a discount right now, so please do email me at davebowden@instituteofideas.com if you're interested after the session. Also, within the kind of broader concept, we've had major retrospectives over the past year at the likes of Lichtenstein, Peter Blake, Patrick Goulfield, and of course there's several more upcoming exhibitions around the work of Richard Hamilton. So there's no doubting that pop art has this still kind of powerful hold over our cultural imagination. But I've gathered together a panel of critics, designers, art historians, and curators to try and unpick the legacy of pop art and to try and understand what we try to understand its legacy. How do we understand it today? To just briefly introduce them to you all, Catherine Gins, who sat to my left, is the curator of the exhibition here at the Barbican, and she's worked on exhibitions such as Bauhaus, Art of Life, which was a fantastic exhibition I greatly enjoyed, so I'm really pleased to have her on the panel today. She's been at the Barbican since 2010, having previously joined from the British Council. Yeah. Sadly, Sam Jacob cannot be with us today. He might need to say that he has a cold. I don't know whether that's cold feet or whether it's an actual illness, but we shall never discover what he thinks about this particular exhibition. To my far right, I have Angus Kennedy, who's my colleague at the Institute of Ideas, and convenes the international series of satellite events we've been holding throughout October and November, with plenty more to come, as well as the Institute of Ideas Academy, an annual 3-day series of lectures and seminars on the great books of history and classics. He is also an author of its own potentially great book, Being Cultured in Defense of Discrimination, which is forthcoming imminently. It's with how much? Well worth looking out for. And then last but not even last, Cole Sharrow, my father, is an architect, writer and broadcaster, who is one of the authors of Manifesto towards the New Humanism in Architecture, which was included in Penguin's 100 Artists Manifestos, back in the kind of pre-Morrissey days when there actually was, you had to be a classic author to be published in the Penguin Classic. So he knows a little bit about the subject, I have to say. But he also writes and blogs extensively on Middle East politics, culture, and all manner of things with his blog, Current Remarks, and avid tweeter. So do check him out if you haven't already encountered him. And last but by no means least, Francis Spalding is Professor of Art History at Newcastle University and one of the UK's leading art historians, having written and lectured extensively on British art since 1900, and recently organised a conference on Richard Hamilton and Victor Marston. I was very lucky and fortunate to share a panel with Francis yesterday on biography. I felt I learned an enormous amount over the course of the discussion just from listening to her discourse on art and history, so I'm glad to have her perspective on the panel. But without much further ado, I'm going to run this kind of, as a kind of in conversation style that with some formal speeches, but I think the obvious place to start, I think, actually would be why pop art design? Why here, why now?
As David said, the exhibition opens on Tuesday, so it's sad really that we couldn't make the time work so that you could have seen the show today. But I guess pop art design is a new look at an old subject that people are endlessly fascinated with. As Dave said, we've got, I've kind of lost count of how many works are in the show, probably around 280 by 70 different artists and designers, and it's very much looking at the way in which artists use the visual language of design within their work and mass production, mass media, and the way in which designers invoke sort of pop spirit, aesthetic, attitudes, conceptual sort of ideas within their work. So it's very much looking at as a survey of commonality between these different types of practice within the pop era. It's kind of loosely chronological, starts with sort of proto-pop moments in the mid to late 50s and then runs through to pop as it tips into very much a postmodernist moment in the late 60s, early 70s. It's an incredibly beautiful show full of stellar artworks as well as works by designers. So we've got Andy Warhol, Lichtenstein, Richard Hamilton, Peter Blake, all of the sort of usual suspects you'd expect to see, but there are also lots of wonderful things that have been unearthed by, I'm not actually the curator of the show, I'm the curator for the Barbican. The exhibition has had a previous life and has been touring in Europe, on the continent before coming here, so I've added to the show to increase the number of women in the exhibition, but also to increase the amount of work that represents what's happening in Britain at that particular moment in time, both in the fields of art and design. So I'll do my best to represent the pop, but...
why do you put the design process of pop art? So we say it's
well, it's a bit... I would say it's the first sort of very comprehensive look at these very specific sort of shared motifs, methods, processes which recognise that designers were working in an experimental way in this period, but also which really gives acknowledgement to how important the design world was to this particular successive artist working in this way. For us, for the Barbican, we like the sort of conversation that happens between different types of practice. We've staged a number of surveys in recent years that look at ideas across different types of practice, art and architecture, or music, choreography, and painting. So it's that sort of cross-disciplinary nature which particularly interested us, and I think will be inspiring to visitors who come to see the show.
We can't write extensively on architecture. So do you think that pop art has had a massive legacy?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it has, and whether that was a positive thing or not, that's another subject to debate. I think we can get into. I think to me in particular, if you want to kind of unpack some of the issues associated with that, because there's this question about what makes it relevant, what makes it continue until today as an attitude. I think from the beginning it was an attitude within art that kind of hitched itself to the vehicle of a self-rejuvenating medium, which is popular culture and mass production, just by nature kind of ever-changing and reproducing itself in new forms. And I think that was a very clever strategy. So I'm quite torn in terms of attitude about it, because to me, and let me kind of slip in another Barbican exhibition reference here, is a few months, I think it was back in February, I reviewed the Duchamp exhibition. I was over there, which was fantastic, and it was looked at the relationship between Duchamp and Cage and Rauschenberg and Cunningham. And I think that was like a precursor moment to the pop art moment that was particularly interesting to me, because I think it was much more playful, and it was much more humorous, and it was much more mischievous. And with the slide towards pop art, I think it becomes a bit more cynical. It becomes a bit more, humor degenerates into irony. Now, that has two aspects to it, and I think we can develop that. One is that irony allows this detachment, if you can keep kind of reproducing the same attitude over time, and we almost see it on the street these days, or we actually do. It's a lifestyle. But on the other hand, it appears to be soulless. It's not as captivating as the works, say, of Rauschenberg or John Cage. So that's my kind of dilemma, and we can develop the subject.
Yes, I mean, do you think that's coming from today? Do you think that's a fair description of pop art? Like, is superficial, soulless, cynical to an extent?
No, I resent the term humour degenerated into irony. I think irony, I thought, was a pretty good thing. And it's not always soulless by any means. It's often very pointed and sharp and alert to what's actually happening. And pop art would be much less fun without the irony. There's a particular work of, Hockney and Richard Hamilton. Yes, and I think, just for instance, take one of the items in Catherine's exhibition. It's a dress made by Stephen Willis, and it's made out of rectangles of PVC, remember that material, and you zip these squares into position in the dress according to what your mood or what the environment is like, and you can move the parts of the dress around according to where you're going. It's great fun and lively and original at the time, and I think that kind of sort of energy is something that we identify in pop art, and I don't necessarily find it always cynical. Then I've got some
well, I suppose I've got a bit more sympathy for Carl's comments on the sort of distancing, ironic aspect of pop art. Duchamp himself expressed some surprise. He said that he'd thrown the bottle wrap and the urinal into the faces of the art establishment as a challenge. And now, look, they're admiring them for their aesthetic beauty. And so, he was obviously part of an assault on tradition, if you like, but the joke may be that that assault was successful, and if you continue being anti-traditional in the absence of a tradition, the joke can kind of fall flat. So in some ways, I think pop is the noise that you put in, of a pin being rather deliberately put into a balloon at the end of a rather bad party. And first of all, I have to admit that I was really into it when I was a student. It was cool, distancing, it was all about the surface. It was a rather convenient cover for my own lack of any depth or profundity at that age. You could be into Warhol's interview magazine and wear the wraparound shades, ideally reflective shades, as opposed to what much like a reflective dress. But I'm also reminded of a quite nice little story. Tom Wolfe wrote a book about the sort of art movements in America in the 20th century called The Painted Word, which is very amusing, as you might expect from Tom Wolfe. He does tell a story about Andy Warhol going to a society dinner party, sort of probably hosted by Peggy Guggenheim, the Upper West Side mining concentration of the American elite. And after a while, people notice that he's not eating. He's just sitting there with a rather bewildering array of cutlery on both sides. And he's a Polak from Pittsburgh, so he's a little bit confused with what to do. He just doesn't eat. And eventually somebody says, Andy, is there a problem with the food? And he covers himself up and says, I only eat candy. And I think there is an element of just uncomfortableness with the kind of the bourgeois high culture tradition, which is based on humanist perspective of the discerning individual who hopes to become better at discernment. And I think pop art is a way of sort of not grappling with that problem. The only other thing that was prompted by your opening comments, Dave, and what other people have said, is that I'm really not sure, and I don't want to be too definitional about this, but I think the point I would make about pop art is that it's anti-definitional. The list of artists that we've heard, Richard Hamilton, Dick Hockney, Jim Dine, Klaus Oldenburg's, Hamburgers, Warhol, Lichtenstein, Kitai, Paolozzi, the list goes on and on and on. I don't know what they have in common. I don't know if you can call pop art a style or a movement in the way you could with Cubism, say. And so, to that extent, it's sort of categorically anti-categorical, refuses to be judged. So, I find it a bit of a problem. I don't know where to situate it.
Well, I just wanted to say something about cynicism and optimism, because I think our show, it's terribly lively. A lot of the work is quite ambiguous. I think you're right. You're not able to read whether this is some form of commentary or complete sort of banal replication. But one of my favourite works in the show, which we've added, is a piece by Joe Tilson called Page One Penelope, which some of you might be familiar with because it usually hangs in the foyer in the British Library. And it's a wooden relief, and the word yes is carved by hand or machine cut and painted by hand, repeated over and over in a grid, a wooden grid, which looks like a bit like a typesetted sort of printing tray. And it's based on the last word James Joyce used, which is yes, which is according to Joyce the most positive word in the English language. And we've plotted in the show because it's about word and typography as visual image in this particular grouping. But that's an emphatically optimistic work. It's not ironic and cynical.
Yeah, Francis first and
Yes, I think if you say it's non-definitional, then you have to explain why people like Clement Greenberg are so offended by what they regard as pop art as a definite movement, and try to write it out of this history of progressive history of modern art. I think people very definitely did get a sense of a movement, a moment, if not, obviously the practices of all these artists are very different, but it does cumulatively add up to something which Carl rightly referred to by using the word attitude. Is it, I mean, perhaps it's not whether it's the place or not, just to say that, well, I think one reason I'm here today is that I teach at Newcastle, which is where a major development occurred that contributed to pop art, and that was the fact that Richard Hamilton got together with another artist, a non-pop art artist called Victor Passmore, and created this so-called basic design course. And it was one of many things that is a very crucial ingredient in the shift in the teaching of art education. And I don't get too boring at this stage about art education, but it does matter to pop art. Because before that, much of the teaching of art in art schools had gone on in front of either the life model in the painting room. You sat down in front of the work of art, and you discussed how to make it, what materials you used, all this sort of thing. It was very much about execution, analysing, looking at, talking about execution. We've seen an enormous pedagogical shift in the teaching of art, and it's now a shift towards conception. You sit down in the art schools today and you discuss the framing discourse around what this other student is doing. And that, what we might call the discursive or linguistic term, was triggered partly significantly at Newcastle when Passmore and Hamilton started emphasising the process and trying to think about all the things around that idea and other things. And at the same time, of course, Hamilton would go down to the depots when they were preparing the billboards to go up on the advertising boards around the city, and he would arrive back in the studio with a whole slew of advertising posters and simply fling them on the floor of the studio and say, do something with that. And so there was this introduction of popular culture, which has been mentioned as a key ingredient in all this, and it really shook things up to such an extent that it was decided by the National Art Education Committee that they had to review the whole teaching of art in art schools in Britain. And they said that William Coldstream, a Euston Road School painter, trained in the art of observation, a very quiet form of realism, to chair this committee and to cut the long story short, what it ratified for the future teaching of art school in this country was very largely the ideas developed at Newcastle and Leeds around the whole basic design course. And this did introduce a major pedagogical shift. And the only...
I'll get out of the green column. That's you do that.
Can I just say that classes has something to show about basic design teaching on a tape record at the moment? if anybody's interested.
Yeah, I mean, rightfully, sort of that part of the, or the entire plan was provoked by the comment about cynicism, which was kind of intentional. But I kind of intentionally didn't finish that sentence, which is it degenerated into soulless, cynical, and detached attitude, which is great, especially today, because I personally think that kind of attitude is a really powerful antidote to political art, which I adore.
And you're writing a book on new humanism now.
It's a manifesto, it's been written already, yeah. But it's specifically, I adore political art. I adore any art that kind of tries to promote itself on the back of its political pretension. I mean, my pet hate is Banksy, and particularly the kind of people who say it's deep, makes you think. I mean, for starters, what kind of person are you that you need to be reminded that you have to think? That's one thing. But also the kind of powerful of the political ideas that are presented are so reduced and oversimplified images. And what people kind of mistake that political attitude with its reduction to a powerful political idea, which I think, to me, it was actually Walter Benjamin who was very prescient in critiquing that attitude before it appeared. So actually we end up in an inverse position today, where the art that is pretending to be the most radical is actually the most subordinated, the most consumed and subordinated and completely non-radical. So to that, what I'm trying to say now, after being discontent with Pope's art, kind of flirtation with commercialism and all that kind of thing, I think now it becomes much more powerful to revive that cynical, detached and soulless attitude that's completely not concerned with that political dimension of art, because to me, it's a very powerful way to regain the autonomy of art, and that's why I'm driving at. And I think this is what we're sorely missing today, is the autonomy of art.
Well, certainly, historically, post-war, there was a reaction against the crude use of art in terms of, socialist realism, Nazi propaganda, and an embracing of art for art's sake. Against that, and Greenberg is very much in that camp, and his alter ego Rosenberg and Green Red Mountain, trying to go as flat as possible. Right? And flatness was what they loved. First of all, in abstract expressionism, and they had to catch up very quickly with pop art, which appeared almost as, before the canvases dried with abstract expressionism. Flatter the better, because then it couldn't be used for anything if it was all on the surface. It was great. I'm throwing interestingly that pop art probably developed out of Britain in the RCA more than it did in America, or it happened in Britain first. It was theorized by a critic called Lawrence Alloway. I have a quote here from 1959, where he says, "Acceptance of the mass media entails a shift in our notion of what culture is. Instead of reserving the word for the highest artifacts and the noblest thoughts of history's top 10, it needs to be used more widely as a description of what society does." So culture gets started to be talked about in an anthropological way rather than an elitist way of the best, i.e. the classical tradition. And it becomes just a description of what is. And you see that clearly in pop art, what is going on with mass production, with consumerism and so on. My problem with it, I suppose, is that I think it's not popular because it's not done for people to admire, it's sort of rather done to them. The cynicism, I think, is in a reflection back at people, that they're assumed lack of choice in the mass consumer society. You have to buy this stuff, and we're showing you, the artist chooses one of those things, soup, tin, hamburger, whatever it is, and reflects that lack of choice back at
and that's more pronounced in Britain than in America.
I would think so, because I think the embarrassment about this sort of Western high cultural tradition immediately post-war is probably more pronounced in Britain, which is run a worldwide empire and so on, and the struggle through the war, racial thinking was not very, elitist thinking was, very much on the back foot. It was in all spheres of life. And our person, which is democratic nation, is on the war. So I think it's not popular because it just does two people rather than asks them to judge what's produced by the artist. And in the same breath, it's not art. Right? It can't be art because it doesn't exist in a tradition, so it can't be original. And it doesn't last. My prediction is that it will not last. It can't have a legacy because it's anti-legacy.
Right, so, I mean, interesting because I don't think very cynicism in that. I wonder because there does seem to be part of its popularity is that there does seem to be a slightly jarring sincerity of it, enjoying the commodities and some things. I mean, that wasn't entirely, it's why it seems like a very American movement. It's a great excitation of Americana and American stuff. So there's a thing about difference. Is that not some of the popularity there?
No, that's spot on, but let me elaborate a little bit on that. That's why I specifically mentioned the kind of Jasper Jones, Cage, Rauschenberg experience, kind of what they did with Duchamp. And it was a real joy about using the artifacts of popular culture within their work. A woman once asked Jasper Jones, she said, "Why do you have Coca-Cola bottles in your art? They're ugly." And he told her, "Well, if you feel they're ugly, I feel sorry for you because you're surrounded by them, and to me they represent beauty." And there was a sense of genuinely this fondness for popular culture, which is always represented in European thinking. Conversely, by the way, something you alluded to, Ernest, the social critique that we get, or artistic even critique that we get the most now, the most fashionable European social critique, is actually very conservative rejection of popular culture that came out of America and its emancipation and emancipatory potential masquerading as radical. So it's actually conservative masquerading as radical, and it always insists on hating all the kind of the popular culture production of America. And that translates into pop art into two different attitudes. So you have the actual celebration of the artifacts of popular culture in America, without wishing to be too black and white about the distinction, versus the kind of the British attitude which feels itself as more subversively critiquing that kind of production. You see it particularly in the work of Hamilton. And that's where kind of these two strands need to be unpicked to understand the social relevance of it. I go back to its foundational moments in America, and there was something genuinely kind of innocent and loving about popular culture as the representation of mass culture, which is something fantastic. It might not be fashionable today in an era of austerity, but to me it's something very, very beautiful and very powerful.
So for us to underlying some notes here.
Well, yes, I agree with Carl, there's a difference between... I agree with Carl, there is a difference between early pop art products in America and kind of taking things home without the irony, and that is definitely in Hamilton's famous just what is it that makes today's home so different, so appealing, for instance. But I think one of the things, before one immediately puts the cynicism in place, is to think about that period in Britain after the war. We had rationing up to the mid-50s. The borough was only invented in, I can't remember the date, late 50s, early 60s. The long-playing record only came in at a certain date. I mean, we are talking about a sort of a world that was very much less plentiful with consumer items than it is today. And so, of course, there was this kind of envy of the emerging, we wanted to copy the American economy, which is burgeoning and moving forward in a way that we were far behind at that stage. So it's in that sort of slightly fragile world that I think we should judge these products at that time. Remember when John McHale went to America and with the independent group at the ICA came back with a trunkload of American comics. We forget that Picture Post was the magazine of choice among many of the public in the 50s because it was the leading photographic magazine and it was in black and white. And so to have a whole trunkload full of comics and colour illustrated magazines in the 1950s was a thing of great excitement. All the intellectuals fell on it avidly. So we need to historically get back to that.
Greater positivity somewhere has been coming through. Particularly, I'm thinking of a number of works by Charles Murray Eames in the exhibition, which many people won't see as pop, but for this particular exhibition, one can make a pop reading of their work. People like Alison and Peter Smithson, who had a very long-standing close relationship with Charles and Mary Eames, their furniture, when they first encountered it in this particular moment in post-war Britain, was, in Peter Smithson's word, Alison Smithson's word, in fact, like objects from another world, from outer space. You know, they were terribly excited by the potential of mass production, and one of the dimensions of the show is about sort of levelling off the hierarchies between fine art practice and design practice. In the spirit of the independent group choosing to take a sort of anthropological look at all forms of visual culture, as it were.
Yes, I mean, I entirely recognise Francis's description of what was going on. And I guess my only plea on this is that if we just leave it as a description of what is and what happened in that period, you know, there was popular culture. And we may speculate about whether or not the attitude of some of the artists was optimistic or pessimistic. I mean, I don't know if we can ever get to the truth of that or if it matters. But my problem is, how do we judge this stuff? Because when it gets into that breaking down, purposeful breaking down of barriers between high and low culture, between the mass-produced and the unique, between craft and art, then how do we say whether or not it's any good? It just seems to flatten out. And that is what pop art really represented, a flattening out of distinction, leaving us, logically, leaving us with no possible reaction to it apart from one of indifference. And that will be its historical legacy. We will be indifferent to it because if something self-defines negatively, then it just needs to keep changing. And it has kept changing very, very quickly. You know, pop art went straight into culture wheels, and there was op art afterwards, and you know, it kept moving into postmodern and contemporary art, and you know, that's not going to be there anymore. Some of it is reflected in its choice of its perishable material that it uses, which are painted neon and shots, and it won't be around for them. So you can like it, you know, that's fine. Whether or not it's art, I'm pretty sure that it's not.
Let me take it in turns. I hear you, Angus. I think your kind of battle is not with pop art, it's with the entire paradigm of contemporary art, more specifically. Because this is not about pop art as a stylistic movement or even an attitude or anything like that. There was a big breakdown of the institutions of art production, distribution, and appreciation, even pedagogy, from the 60s onwards, that is jarring with our traditional conceptions of more elitist and middle of how art should be done. And that's not specifically to do with pop art. We've ended in a world where we've denigrated art, or back to any other word. We've kind of smashed the door so much. You know, the slogan was smash the doors, allow the people in, allow the consumption of art, production of art, allow that kind of thing. That end up in a world where all these values have been lost. So I think to regain that, and what I'm suggesting is perversely actually, pop art could be utilized now to regain that sense of detachment. And let me just give the example of, today you want to get a grant for an art project. If you don't have a whole load of stuff about its social relevance and its engagement and its contribution anti-obesity and its contribution to the environment and making awareness of climate change and diversity, I could go on. Yeah, you won't get your grant, right? Fair enough. But here where I come to the other point, which is about the commercialization of pop art, where people say, well, how could someone pay £20 million for a Damien Hirst art? And instead to suggest that's completely, entirely arbitrary process. It's not. There are processes of
determining aesthetic value at play over here. They just don't fit your conceptions of what beauty is, but they are operative, they are working. People who are paying 20 million pounds for a Damien Hirst work are not stupid. There are mechanisms for establishing this aesthetic value that have changed with the times.
So, Francis, you want?
I'm not going to go down the line of whether it's worth going how many millions of Damien Hirst, but I think we're missing something here in this debate, which is how quickly pop art opened itself to other disciplines like fashion, pop music. You know, one of Hamilton's students, Brian Ferry, went to set up Roxy Music, and a lot of his pupils went and taught at other art schools, and this sudden nexus, this sudden coming together of pop, fashion, illustration, Peter Blake doing the record cover for the Beatles LPs and the Time magazine, the Beatles that you had in the show. This kind of sort of sudden communication with things outside the tiny world of a fine art studio with a solitary artist beavering away on their still life or their, so on. It was a tremendously energetic thing. And the other thing that happened, we forget that it was extremely expensive to go across the pond to America in the 50s and early 60s, and very few people did. And even Studio International, one of the leading magazines at that time, had very little contact with the leading artists and critics in New York, which they were trying to write about. And so when Hamilton did this thing of becoming good friends with Duchamp, because he was fascinated by Duchamp, so you probably know there's a long history to his relationship with Duchamp. Duchamp had a major retrospective, I think, in Pasadena at the Simon Warhol Museum, and he asked Hamilton to go over and be his kind of right-hand man. Hamilton didn't quite have the money, he had to ask at the Lawrence Alloway to help find American funds. Anyway, so Hamilton was seen walking around with Duchamp, and the New York art world said, "Who is this Englishman? What is he? Where is he?" He had immediate access to the New York art world and made friends with Andy Warhol and other people. So when he had a student who had a bit of money, someone called Mark Lancaster, whose parents were owners of Bradford Mill, and Mark was sent across to New York and with an introduction to Andy Warhol. And so he went along and spent the whole day or afternoon watching what was going on in the studio. At the end of the day, he went up to Andy Warhol and said, "Thank you very much, it's been a fantastic experience, I really enjoyed it, really great." Andy Warhol didn't even look up, he just said, "See you tomorrow," which was his repeated favour, everything happening the same as the day after, and so on. But I mean, this was unique. This art school had very good relations with America, and it spread from there. Suddenly, British art was not again looking at itself, looking at its native traditions, gaining strength, and at some point it was starting a more international outlook.
Well, in the Renaissance, it wasn't too easy to travel around either, but, you know, I suppose I reject that picture of fine art being this closed little world. Dürer got on his bike and went to Venice, and people...
in the Renaissance period, I mean, artists had multiple roles. I mean, they would do all kinds of jobs for the religions, and it's not quite so.
Probably didn't include starting pop bands, but I brought up the Renaissance as another period of optimism and exchange of artistic ideas that has proved itself, we can see from distance, to have established a tradition and left us with great works of art. I just don't think that pop art can have the same capacity, because I think it rests in its heart, or in its absence of heart, if you like, on a negative self-definition. Your point, Francis, about Warhol is to the mark. He repeatedly stated that he wanted to be like a machine. He wanted to dehumanize himself. He wore the same clothes every day, the stripy jumper and the grey jeans and the Chelsea boots. He wanted everything to be as everyday, humdrum and repeatable as it could, to be like a machine. Now, that's an attitude, for sure, right? But it's a very, very different attitude to the optimism of the Renaissance, in which man wanted to be like a god rather than a machine.
But, I mean, is it true? I mean, as much as I understand the points about legacies, I mean, it's true that pop seems to have had a bigger legacy than it even expected itself to have. At the time, it's still enormously popular. I mean, that's the amongst sort of art world. So, I mean, is it still not? Is it a bit much to say move towards beauty within pop, that there was an appreciation of beauty within a lot of these works because its legacy is.
You need to go to the gallery to see how awesome and beautiful the image is. It's exquisite. We have a painting that Andy Warhol made of a matchbook which had some Coca-Cola advertising on the front. It's a fantastic, it's a sublimely beautiful painting. It's your point, you can choose to see beauty or not. It's just one of the aesthetics.
But then a bit, I guess that isn't that, that's what you, it's a question of how you define beauty or judge beauty.
I guess my issue with the way Catherine's posing it is you can paraphrase what Catherine just said, is you can take it or leave it. Now, I think art has to have a greater claim on us than you can just take it or leave it. It should be more than just whether you meet your subjective fancy. And one of the ways in which it does is by trying to be original within the context of a tradition that allows us to judge it against other works of art. That's my point at the beginning. Pop art operates by denying its role in that place. So, I think beauty is at the end of the day human beauty, and there's not much humanity, I think, in display in pop art.
How?
Yeah, if there is beauty, I think, in this specific period related in pop art, it's accidental beauty. And it's something, yes, again, you can come across in many ways, but its intentionally wasn't meant to be beautiful. And that's, again, when I come to that point, there is a departure from Warhol on, which is about kind of robbing it of this soulfulness, playfulness, mischievousness, and that's why I keep coming to the point that it becomes ironic in the sense that it becomes formulaic. And that, to me, is the dulling effect. Duchamp never kind of descended into that moment. It was always about having that impulse and kind of playing the joke and having a sense of possibility about it. But then it becomes a very formulaic, self-reproducing thing, and it was meant to be like that. And that transformation happened for very specific reasons that we need to understand in the context of the time. Because there was these high institutions of art, it was almost like a religion you couldn't get into. They were fighting against high modernism. They were fighting against the subjective pretensions of abstract expressionism and all that kind of thing. But that works for 10, 15, 20 years. By now, it's a completely self-exhaustive process, I think, if we want to kind of look at it genuinely. And all we end up with, the absolute, I think, ultimate product of that is the Dalston hipster as a phenomenon. And this is where a self-parodying individual who is a collection of references to things that are external to him or herself. And this is, I think, the ultimate tragedy of pop art.
You emphasise twice, I guess, this worry that you have that it doesn't have any tradition behind it. And with every movement, there's usually a kind of shift or direct challenge to the previous movement. So it's not as if tradition is a straightforward parallel railway line. But I think, you walk into that exhibition very obviously, for instance, the Lichtenstein belongs very definitely to a representational tradition and to a fine art tradition. He's taken a comic image, presumably quite small, blown it up huge, altered it according to fine art, subtle, sophisticated rearrangements to make the impact he wants on a huge canvas. And it's a very, very powerful figurative painting in a comic, using the language of comics admittedly, but it's still within that tradition. You could call it a modern history painting if you wanted. You wanted to fit it into a tradition. And I think there are many moments like that when pop art does have a place within the history.
Another phenomenal Lichtenstein, which is a painting which Francis can see in about 5-minute whirlwind tour of the exhibition, which is a sort of very mechanical reproduction of a painted brushstroke. And you can see that as sort of an extension of a comment on abstract expressionism. Denial of the complete subjectivity of that particular vision.
Okay, can I see questions or points of... Yeah, there's... Okay, there's... Yeah, okay, there's... let's start off with the two at the back and then you wait forward now.
I realise it's quite a long session. There's quite a lot to potentially kind of thrash out, actually. I would make a plea that, given that there seems to be a bit of a split between commentators and historians, that the historians who are very expert in establishing the context of the period of the work of that period, that they may be, I'd be very interested to hear more kind of qualitative expression of why it endures. Because when process you talk about it, then you obviously have your fingers on the facts, and you're able to establish precisely why things happen. Now, the conflict in the panel seems to be a little bit that Angus is asking, well, why should we continue to care? Right? Why should we continue to care? I also think that Catherine's being a little disingenuous by saying that things are beautiful, without necessarily justifying her criteria for what she means by the beautiful in the context of the work here. I think that there is, however, there's a broad issue here, which I think Angus is trying to touch on a little bit, which is that actually sensibility, the sensibility of a moment in time, and Francis, you described the atmosphere of Britain after the war. One could also identify similar issues of social attitude and social mood in, say, the apprehension of popular culture in, say, French art during the 60s. Every country in Europe responds to the idea of America, particularly in a particular way, at that moment, to the idea of consumerism, the idea of plenty, and industry in particular ways. But the key thing for me is what is the ethos of being human that is being expressed? Because one thing about the cynicism and irony that we find in pop has some relation to a rather peculiar sense, combination of both euphoria and a sense of apocalypse about the time. It is the time of the nuclear bomb. It is the time of industrialization, which is both almost utopian, but at the same time somehow out of control. And it is also the generation that released itself from the burden of the war and wants to live, and wants to please itself, and wants to enjoy life, but under the shadow of a certain kind of possible catastrophe. And so I think that the real issue that kind of becomes the question for me is what does it tell us? What is enduring about this period? About what is enduring about its understanding of what it meant to be human at that moment. Because the issue of surface, the issue of lack of depth, the issue of that kind of intoxicated blankness, which Warhol so perfectly characterizes, it's a way of dealing with a moment of being human. And I think, so that this is not necessarily, obviously, this could be a very pleasant historical show, and I'm very much looking forward to seeing it, but I would like to know from maybe Catherine and from the historian why we should continue to care about it now. Because I think in a way, Angus's terminology is a little bit particular, but I would be great to understand why we should continue to care and what it should continue to tell us about what it means to be.
There's a lot to unpack on there, but we've got plenty of time for questions, so very interesting. So we make sure I get everyone in the issue. You could try to give them
okay, yes, kind of continuing from that. I mean, just talking say about specifics. I think pop art is a very interesting moment in art. And you look at artists like Andy Warhol or Lichtenstein. Just think about two exhibitions, like going to an Andy Warhol exhibition a few years ago, Lichtenstein more recently. And I felt Warhol had something quite interesting to say. And I felt Lichtenstein was a bit of a one-trick pony. And didn't really get any sense of insight. So I think, obviously, there are artists within a movement that might be more interesting than other artists, and that's fair enough. But I suppose just thinking about what it goes to question what it means in terms of history, so what has happened now with art, it's become increasingly ephemeral. And so, there's the idea of contemporary art being kind of, performance art and installations and things like that don't kind of last. And I wonder whether this sense of kind of dead-endedness in art, which I think worries me a bit about pop art, that it's sort of like, it makes some very interesting comments on art and art, but kind of doesn't lead anywhere in terms of the development of art. And in fact, what we're seeing now is sort of a constant circling around, often quite banal issues in relation to sort of some of the contemporary art. And even when people say something interesting, it's not there for very long because it's just performance and there's no intention in the artist to make a statement that might carry into the future, which isn't necessarily a responsibility of the artist, but it kind of gives you think that artists, you know, any individual at some level wants to leave a mark in the future. If you've got that kind of talent, why not say something that's going to, you know, go beyond now?
Okay, and then sorry for the lady at the top, and then I'll take the lady back, and then I'll try to take some response to that, but I will go back out to you guys. Just in front of you guys.
Hello, I think I'd like to kind of address my question to Francis as an art historian and to Catherine as a curator of the exhibition. Something that struck me, that every single artist that you've talked about or named in the reference of pop art has been male. And my question is, pop art, boy art?
Okay, I'm just lady down the front of the class.
Yes, initially your presentation you focused on the display aspect of pop art and the critique aspect, and with the display aspect, the possibility for optimism. A bit that I thought would touch on the idea of some humanism in pop art is many of the artists worked on nostalgia as well, on romance, and the question of time. Because in the selection of comic strips as inspiration for the work, many of these comics were already out of date. And so actually, in the case of somebody like Lichtenstein, he was already dealing with the passing of a moment and the romance of the passing of a moment. And, I suppose you could say, an old, a more traditional approach of how do you give significance to the transitory? How do you capture that and make it last? So they are not, there's more than the blankness. And in addition to that also, with the transitoriness, is the time. And that seems intellectually probably one of the most interesting bits of pop art, was the blank recording of a news event as it happens. What about the politics of the car crashes, the riot scenes, this blank recording, and how you deal with that blankness where the romance has been removed? So there are more complex issues involved with nostalgia, romance, and blank politics.
Okay, I think I want to get something to there. I will come back out again for more.
I think this lady's point answers the gentleman's point, is that there is a lot of there is depth to the work. I mean, this particular show doesn't deal necessarily with the historical sort of moments that you were talking of, the politics of the time so particularly, but it is there, and I think that the blankness for me is more open-endedness. There's readings that one can make about these works which on the surface seem like surface quotations of different types of imagery, but you can choose to read into that an awful lot of theory, ideas, thinking. There's a great deal of subjectiveness in the work of some pop artists. So I think it is there. It's richer and more textured than perhaps we're discussing, and we're discussing two protagonists, Lichtenstein and Warhol. There are so many more people who are working in the pop idiom, didn't necessarily call themselves pop artists, who come from quite a variety of starting points, or didn't make work in this banal way. Just about to go on to that. We, the female curator from the Modernity Visit, who we've been working closely with on this presentation, this exhibition, and I felt very strongly that we wanted to increase the number of women in the show from 2 to at least double figures, which we have done. We've added a lot of work by female artists and designers. It's still an area that's been sort of under-researched. I think there are a lot of academics at the moment focusing on the work of women artists at this time. The leading female pop artist in Britain was Pauline Boty, who died very tragically young at the age of 28. And currently there's a survey of her work at Wolverhampton Art Gallery, and we have worked with them to include the painting that they had in their show, which we brought here, which we're very lucky to be able to show. And there have been recent surveys sort of reappraising what women were making at this time. And some of that work does have the... You were saying something interesting earlier, which I've completely forgotten, but it made me think of Jan Howard's work, who was Peter. We have a wonderful piece in the show called Cowboy, which is by Jan Howard, who was an American artist who came here to study the slave and married Peter Blake while she was here. And it's the co-author of the Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band album cover, and the cowboy was intended to be on that album cover. And he's a sort of very enigmatic, life-size soft sculpture of an idea of a sort of cinematic idea of a rodeo cowboy. And I can't remember why I was going to talk about that.
Okay, well, I was going to hold up this for us. We had a couple of questions probably.
I think some things have already been answered to that question about the human element in pop art. Well, we have to be aware that there is a different sort of ideology going on in American pop art to British. You can see it very visibly in British art. There's so much greater range of approach and tactic and strategy. For instance, the David Hockney Type of G painting, which is in the exhibition, followed on that remark from Kittai later in the Royal College when he was aware that the American abstract expressionism just arrived in London. The students at the Royal College were covering canvases with painting bitumen, setting fire to them, bicycling over them and so on. And it didn't mean anything to Hockney, and he goes to see Kittai and says, I don't know what to paint. And Kittai says, paint what interests you. And so he's very fond of typing T, he puts it up. And so immediately that's a very sort of autobiographical use of popular culture to make a work of art come to life for the artist and obviously for other people too. And I think at the other end of the spectrum is, of course, Hamilton's involvement with things like the Kent State shootings and also his fascination and his portrait of Gatesfield, also his fascination with the method of how images are produced. You may remember when he did that print based on the shooting of the students in the Vietnam protests in Kent State University. He was watching television and had this Polaroid camera beside him. What you were already seeing on the television was the product of the camera. It was then filtered through the camera, through the television, and again, then photographed again by Hamilton on the television. And that whole understanding of how images come to us and the distance they travel and so on, what happens to them in those processes, is part, of course, of the fascination, particularly of Hamilton's pop art. The notion that it should be either optimistic or pessimistic, and this totalizing desire for total optimism seems to be untrue to life, let alone art. These things are mixed, and they're both are there in pop art. There is a huge amount of optimism in the sense of excitement about new products, new opportunities, new ways of doing things, getting rid of the old and so on. But there is also the dark cloud of awareness of the Cold War and other things in there too, without any doubt. So I just think that it had enormous fertility, and that seems my chief reason why I think pop art matters. Of course it led on to celebrity culture, which we may all know, and things like that. But it tried for newness and nowness. I think if you look at popular culture today and too automatically try to put it into art, it doesn't work in the same way. We are too cynical, sophisticated, sophisticated or something or other to cope with it in the same way now. But at that moment, in the late 50s and 60s, it somehow did. And if you watch the film Blow Up, I mean, the first thing you see in Get Up the Cars going to it's this economy, what's it called, the building, Economist building. And later on, there's of course an artist based at showing Ian Stevenson's paintings. So I think that that sense of things happening in the fine art world or in the art world immediately feeding into film, fashion, pop art, pop music and so on was a very exciting moment. And we should admire and enjoy it in looking back on it. And I think it has had a legacy and it still inspires some students to strive for the new and to look at them now.
Yeah, I think basically what we're saying now is we think there was an element of humanity to pop art's original moment because basically their irony, by our jaded standards, wasn't quite ironic enough. So basically it's like their irony was really pathetic, they couldn't do it very well, whereas they thought they were doing it very well, and that to us comes across as humanity, and I think this is the real problem about pop art in a way, because we've so ingrained this attitude and conception of art to such a degree, and we're such master ironists that it starts to acquire some semblance of humanity that wasn't probably intended originally. In fact, they would be offended if they heard us saying that. However, the winning question to me, and I don't know if you do that normally in Back of if you hand out prizes for the best question or comment from the floor. Yeah, I want to. Is the point about the drum roll, the dead-endedness of our phenomenon. That's it. Because I think, again, that's one of the problematics that I was pointing at. Pop art arrives at the question of abstraction, and flatness wasn't something that pop art introduced. I mean, it's the question that kind of preoccupies painting throughout the modern era. And then, kind of, it finishes. When they're painting flags, or when they're painting numbers, that's it. You finish the whole process of inquiry about the nature of abstraction and depth. That's it. What can you do after that? So it's sort of completely self-consumed, that aspect. Which is bringing me to the point where I'm really surprised we haven't used so far in discussions the self-referentiality of pop art practices. And this kind of preoccupation of the nature of the medium, nature of art itself, wasn't just going to take you somewhere else. And this is a big question facing us now. How do we move to the next stage of art production? Do we just keep repeating these practices and become more and more kind of skilled in their production? Or actually, is there going to be a big kind of, I hate to use the word paradigm shift, but a kind of transformation that then will take us to the next stage? And my kind of plea would be, we have to break free from that introspective, self-referential, medium-obsessed way of looking at art. It has to be about something. It has to be about the soul, the spirit, the questions about the human conditions and our obsessions. And I think that would also be a panacea to all this sort of, look at any art gallery these days, particularly if it represents a particular region or whatever, the one central theme to it is identity. So you get, for example, an art exhibition about artists from Iran, and it's all about the condition of being Iranian in the 21st century and Islam and the hijab and all that kind of thing. That even artists that now see themselves through these lazy abstractions of identity. And that's such an oppressive kind of dysfunctional thing for art. So I think it's almost, we want to say, enough pop art, let's rediscover subjectivity and the individual so we can move forward.
I guess. Well, I suppose it is worth talking about Warhol because, I mean, he does express it the best. I mean, not just the famous for being famous stuff, but if you think of his movies, like New York State movie, you have a non-movie with non-actors directed by a non-director, and what you get is 48 hours of time passing and shadows over the New York State building. It's not the most exciting movie you'll ever likely to see. Now, you could, as the panel sort of largely are, I'm afraid, make up stuff about it. You could say that this is an interesting expression of transience and time passing, but I think you do have to just be a bit more honest about it. It is just about time passing. And I think a lot of what was springboard or a legacy for future traditions. I don't get your point, Francis, about whether or not it's optimistic or pessimistic. On the surface, you know, there were silver balloons and there was a silver factory, and it seemed to be a sort of faux embrace of the future and now. I think it was really just about a non-relationship to the past. And that is the problem of it. You know, it's not so much about what they did or they didn't, it's that they just didn't have that relationship anymore, which I think just has to leave us indifferent to. Another expression, apart from the films of it, of course, is the performance art phenomenon, which happens in, you know, and again, you know, the aesthetics of Carol Schumann's, you know, meat joy, rolling around naked in, you know, fish and chicken carcasses, may be one thing or another. She did recreate it recently, but she won't keep doing it. And it's the nature of performance art not to be there anymore. And again, you can make stuff about it. So, how now? Yeah, okay, well, it is very how now, but it's also just not doing something, right? Cindy Sherman not being herself. Yeah, no, very interesting. I mean, but it can be as interesting as putting a mirror on the wall, staring into it, your reflection, and meditating on the transience on your own mortality. You can say it's all about subjectivity. Well, but I mean, actually, you probably might spend your time better doing that.
Okay, so I'm going to do you have a question? Yeah, so there's a guy there in the shirt, and there's a guy right next to the barber in the shirt. There's manic.
I wondered, Brightness, if you could see the Impressionists who started the rock really by questioning the classical art. But I suppose you could say that they tried to reinvigorate the tradition by ridiculous tradition, in I guess, to the sense that the pop artists didn't do that. I think artists, okay, a few years back there's lots of talks about the end of art and the end of art being the end of everything. But people will do something, and maybe be not so hard on the pop artists. It's an experimentation. It's a trying to find something new, albeit unsuccessfully. I think also the other thing is the society itself. You can't blame the artists for that. Or maybe they don't have the material to work with, the grand narratives, or whatever. They don't have that material to work with. Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
That's a good question. Yeah, so, well, actually, you might as well take mine first, but then go back to them.
I'm just trying to figure out what the world would be like if pop art didn't happen. Because, in a sense, if one looks at contemporary Western art, there was a sort of exhaustion of the sort of humanism, or the ennobling qualities of Renaissance art, particularly after the war. And what, you know, if one's looking at the sort of remnants or the kind of legacy of that kind of art, it leads to a sort of rather, sort of bad romantic realism, which is still trying to kind of keep those qualities that I think Angus is defending so eloquently. But in reality, that kind of work is maybe popular, but it's not very good actually. And I think with pop art, what it did was really just, as I think we've all said, capture the moment. There was a historical kind of shift with mass production, with television, with music and so forth. And in a sense, I think it was a sort of two-edged image. It celebrated it, but also critiqued it. And the legacy of that, the endurance, is what maybe is the sort of the mass culture that perhaps we see in pop music and design and so forth. So, I suppose the question I'm saying is that what were the other kind of activities going on in contemporary art? Was it just bad romantic realism, for example?
Yeah, and so there's a guy in the bar in the shirt.
value of pop art in art history is invaluable, especially in the 20th century. For me, it's one of the greatest kind of steps forward that we had in terms of the general understanding of the concept of art. That I would, it's been talked about a lot, but I would compare it to Duchamp. It's that idea of desacralizing the object of art that obviously opens up the concept to basically infinite number of interpretations, and we kind of look at it with a bit of mixed feelings, because we lost that clear-cut understanding of what art is that we had during the Renaissance, which had a lot to do with aesthetics. And but I think it's a really important step, because it kind of made people understand that it's much more complex. There is a complexity behind it that is that it can't be described in simple terms. And for me, it's even a step forward from Duchamp, because it's not purely provocation aimed at, like, in a very philosophical way. By using like images from popular culture, this process of desacralizing becomes relatable to by a very, very large audience, and therefore the world has been presented art through these like popular culture quotations as something that you would never ever imagine art to be like. And this is for me like an incredible step forward. Obviously it has many, maybe even negative reactions or results arising from it, but it is for me definitely a step forward, and I would like to know what you think about it.
Anyone? Okay, yes.
I just said thank you for that most helpful remarks, and just to say that that desacralizing art, that using images that reach a very wide audience, opening up art to a much wider public than just to rent down to Cork Street or wherever those days to look at art, it was very important to this. And if you think about after the war, the Labour government was brought in by a large majority after the war. There was great hope of social renewal, and there was great hope that there would be an opening up of opportunity to many more people. And yet within a short period of time it became clear that no, the publishing houses, the BBC and so on, were still in the control of the Oxbridge educated elite. And this was a moment when actually that got kicked out the window. And anyone could enter the art world, and it was sort of a much more free for all there, I think. So I partly welcome the kind of things you're saying.
Which is precisely why I hate that term and everything it represents. Why should art be easy? Why should art be opened up to anybody? Art has its own integrity, and you have to do the hard work to understand it, to enter into it, and to kind of become creative and engaging about it and that kind of thing. I think the worst thing you can say to an audience is, we're making this accessible to you. It's basically, you're idiots, we want to help you out because you won't get it on your own. And I completely fundamentally disagree with that. Listen, there's desacralizing, which is, and then there's overkill. I mean, you desacralize for 20, 25 years, and then that's enough. You've just killed every single fundamental aspect of the way we understand art practice, consumption, production, and pedagogy. There's nothing left of it, and all of that has been instrumentalized, marketized. All of these things have been absorbed. We can't desacralize anymore, for God's sake. It's just we've bled art dry. We need to have some spirit or some integrity, some sense of representing something beyond just this dead cow that we're kind of flogging. I mean, and it has to stop at a certain point. Now the problem is, if you take Dan Angus's position, is where do you go more forward and you start floating ideas like beauty, and I'm kind of really like a parody Angus, is you do what the Brits do, which is you rediscover painting and beauty and landscape, and come on, that's such a joke. You can't rediscover painting and landscapes to go to the countryside. That's not the way forward. That's what I'm trying to say. There is something from all that tradition, the idea of newness, the idea of radicalism, the idea of new media, the idea of new forms, but it all has to be done by stepping back away from this kind of self-consuming, blasé narcissism of pop art. There is something great that needs to happen. But one thing that I really want to pick on that we haven't talked about, and I'm going to talk about briefly, which I think might be some sort of indication of how things can go, is I love this idea that Francis was talking about of pop art pilgrimages to America in the 60s, you know, people going to consume not in the high altars of European traditional art cities, but kind of going to LA. And something similar to what happened in pop art happens in architecture, when British architects who are trained in the kind of the older traditions go and discover Los Angeles, and they think it's the greatest thing ever, and come back and things come out of that like archigram and walking cities, and brilliant stuff, visionary, futuristic. Nothing has happened like that in the history of architecture for the past 50 years since then. That was a moment of great optimism, and in fact, it still determines until today what our conception of visionarism in architecture is. And that's why I think I'm still kind of torn about that particular historic moment. I want to kind of try to take it away from just the pop art definition.
So I'm going to let Angus respond to landscapes and things.
I didn't say either of those things ever.
That's why I said that.
So I don't feel too pushed to defend that idea that I'm a sort of nostalgic throwback, but I'll try and clarify what I do mean. On the desacralization point, which is great, and I agree with you, Carl, there's overkill. I think sadly there's probably no limit to how far you can keep desacralizing the world and tearing down walls and opening doors and making a virtue of that desacralization process. The most recent example was the sort of torture room of the soul that was installed in the heart of the National Gallery. The sort of landing robot shapes, poking doubting finger at Christianity, as if Christianity needed any more mocking at the beginning of the 21st century. And I wonder there what the National is thinking by trying to get an artist like that in, who'd never been in the National before by his own admission. He doesn't care about what he thinks a lot of academic paintings in there, and wants to do something challenging. So, institutions can continue to tear themselves apart in the name of being relevant to the now. Don't doubt the ability of that to continue. My question is, if we're interested in changing that process, interested in some form of resacralization of the world, it's a hugely difficult question, because where are we? Once you've broken down all the walls and opened all the doors and let everything in, and there are no limits, how can you say where you are? You don't. There isn't a basis on which to stand. And so you're left in this sort of existential problem is, I think the way Sartre put it was, how do you jump when you have no legs? And the answer, of course, is jump higher. So that's the sort of problem we're in. And the only space I can see for addressing this is in amateurs sort of doing it for themselves. Not in the sense that Andy Warhol's brother did, who realised, Mike in Pittsburgh realised that Andy was on to quite a good money-making deal, and he shut down transformed his mechanics garage into a screen printing factory. I think it's probably still running, or it only closed down 5 or so years ago, where you could get a Warhol's brother one, and who's to say it wasn't as good as the so-called original. Not in that sense of amateur artists, but in individuals doing art to try and create beauty. I mean, it's going to be difficult to start from pretty much nowhere, but I think we have to make that effort, because we have that capacity in ourselves to not be traditional in the sense of going back, because you never can. You can never restore what has been lost. But you can be traditional in the sense of exercising your ability to lay down tracks.
I just want to say how glad I was that Carl and me are in agreement about the importance of Los Angeles and so on, and Raina Ballin's book being still sort of vital today in the whole discussion about creative cities and so on. I mean, it's such an original look at it. Where we disagree is that I would still stick with William Morris's statement, what business have we with art at all, unless all can share it. So, and finally to your thing, I would just love to ask Angus, if I may, could you help us by giving us your definition of beauty?
You're very smart.
We've got 4 minutes, so it should be fine.
Just point to me, Catherine, is it?
No, I just, quite what Francis was saying back to the accessibility issue. I don't think any of the artists we talked about today started off making work in an attempt to make it accessible, or to make it because they wanted to be accessible. I think it's just to default with this imagery and the choices that they made are already there.
Can I just see if there are any last questions and points?
The key belief commodification, but the long and way Hamilton pop artist transition for quote from 56 didn't really mean anything until the first books came out in, 66, 67, Lucy Lippard, Michael Compton, Margaret Livingston. Pop art then became defined way after pop music or Cedric Price in the 60s. The real legacy, I think, Carl's really interesting because the real legacy of this, the conversation, so pop art is commodification, the real conversation from the independent group, how pop art developed, is much more to do with article with situationism, which developed with Pistoletto and people like that. The American side is completely different. That is about commercialism, commodification, an art and gallery system. It's a different way of, the conversation was through Jean Berger and Heron. There was a European side and an American side. It was very difficult to talk about pop art as a single entity.
Okay, so one of the problems I think we face is, or perhaps it was just sort of, I think we face is the problem of skill and knowledge, in the sense that to what extent are artists today given a sense of the importance of their skill in art and their knowledge of art as they develop as artists? I'm just thinking about some of the sort of more contemporary works I've seen recently, and it seems to me that there's some very interesting ideas in them, but the ideas themselves don't kind of develop very much. There seems to be a lack of skill in the execution. It's almost like the skill side doesn't matter. So you can, create something that just doesn't get to anything.
I think that is partly the result of the thing I talked about before, which is this move from the concentration on execution to conception, so that the skills are perhaps certainly less trait than they used to be. Could I just answer your, was it earlier question about why do things have been art and other thing? An artist I know recently remarked that when he was starting out to have an exhibition that there was in Cork Street for 3 weeks was the absolute tops that you could go for. And in about the 1990s, it was, they had 3 days of an art fair, not as a solo or one-person exhibition, but what mattered there was who you were exhibiting with. And he rather cynically remarked, and now it's 3 hours in an auction house in China is what makes a reputation. So the speed at which things are changing are very great.
Well, it's not every day professor of art history. I was just meant to define what beauty is, and I really should throw it back to you. It's your sort of day job. But maybe that's the problem with institutions that should be clearer about what beauty will be. My in 30 seconds attempt would be the miracle of being human is that we're originators of origins, if you like. We can create new beginnings. Art is something we produce in the world that is more or less beautiful, I would think, in terms of how it is more or less expressive of that freedom to rise above who we are biologically and by nature and our limits, and to express those moments rare and never full, that somehow that we long for in life, and should try and be more expressive rather than less. So beauty and truth, and they do go together, as the great man Nemo said. Are expressive of our freedom and our reason, i.e. what makes us distinctively human. And art has always been one of the greatest
close with a very pessimistic point is I think beauty is no longer possible and it won't be possible until we have a kind of moral revolution. So I think the idea of beauty itself is a reflection on our distinctive being as a species, as humanity. And it was kind of tried during the period when especially we detached ourselves from nature and kind of subjugated the conception of nature. So the fundamental idea of beauty as we understood it classically was to do with our separateness from nature. It's not possible anymore. It's not absolutely, we can't reach it because today we hate ourselves. As a species, we've kind of trained to kind of completely become averse to the notion of human and humanity and our possibility. And we won't regain the idea of beauty. It's not only about artistic kind of experimentation until, I'm going to sound so kitschy now, we learn to love ourselves again.
I have a note